Okay, so this class will be on Julius Caesar, the famous play by William Shakespeare. So we're taking a bit of a different course here, right? For the first part of the class, we were looking at different works in political theory, ancient Greeks, for example, Plato, Aristotle, and then the Roman thinker and politician Cicero, and then Polybius, who was a Greek historian, but talked about the Romans. Now, the first group of readings that we went over, though, were the Orestia by Aeschylus. So we're kind of returning to that to a certain extent, whereas we're now looking at the works of William William Shakespeare, and we'll basically be doing this throughout the rest of the semester as well. So the first play that I have selected is Julius Caesar, which is one of Shakespeare's most famous plays, of course. Many people are probably already familiar with it. Before getting into the play itself, I want to talk, a little bit about some of the, background here. One thing which has come up a lot in recent years is this question over authorship in Shakespeare. This theory that Shakespeare himself did not actually write his plays. It's an interesting idea, obviously, because Shakespeare is such an important, figure within our culture. To think that he may, be a mirage or something like that, or that he may not have actually written his plays is an interesting theory. It does not seem to be very widely accepted, though. I think most people have sort of ruled this out as a plausible theory. Again, when I first heard it, it sounded like an interesting idea. I noticed that a lot of people, I guess I was on some kind of like message board or something like that, and people were writing in comments, very angrily, almost like taking it like a personal attack or something like that, to even suggest that Shakespeare may be, a fraud, or that somebody else may have actually written these plays. And I thought, okay, that's kind of, people don't like to have their cherished beliefs kind of, disturbed or upset or something like that. But then as you look into it more, the motivations behind this theory, which again does not seem to be widely accepted, and I think it's been more or less put to rest now at this point, at least as far as I know. But the motivations behind it in the first place seem to be kind of sinister, I would say, in some ways, and that apparently people believe that Shakespeare, as a commoner, as a person of a non-aristocratic background, would have even been capable of writing these plays, which I think obviously reveals a very elitist kind of condescending attitude, right? The idea that I mean, because it is of course a mark of the sophistication of Shakespeare's writings that they show great insight into human nature, the historical knowledge, as well as of course obviously the literary technique that are on display here. These theorists believe that this simply goes beyond what a commoner would have been capable of. Some of the leading contenders that have been alleged to have written plays include Francis Bacon, who's pretty well known, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, William Stanley, the 6th Earl of Derby, again showing their aristocratic origins here, as well as fellow playwright and friend of Shakespeare, actually, Christopher Marlowe, who was a very noted playwright in his own day. Now, if Marlowe did it, I mean, that would have been very interesting, considering that Marlowe died in 1593, and most of Shakespeare's most famous plays date from after that period of time. So he would have had to have come back from the dead, or faked his death or something like that, in order to do something like that. Anyway, I'll just mention it in passing. I mean, it has become a theory that tends to be talked about more so nowadays. I think, like I say, I think it's been a pretty widely discredited theory at this point. I've never really looked into it that closely myself, other than just in a very superficial way. And apparently, at least according to the Wikipedia page on this, I think something like 80 different authors have been sort of put forward as different candidates for authoring Shakespeare's plays. I mean, that in itself kind of shows you, I think, maybe how sort of absurd this idea has become. When you can think of that. I mean, it seems like almost any notable person within England at this period of time has been put forward basically as an author for Shakespeare. Anyway, so when we deal with some of the key themes, and especially of course how this relates to political philosophy, I think of course there are certain themes that seem to jump out here. One, of course, is the question of whether or not Caesar's murder is actually justified or not, which of course sort of echoes an earlier question I asked about whether or not Agamemnon's murder is justified in the Orestia. Does Caesar deserve to die? Is he a tyrant? Notably, the play itself does not really show him doing anything particularly tyrannical or really at all even. Is he a tyrant in the making? Are there indications that he's going to become a tyrant? To that extent, you do find some clues within the play. I think the most obvious sign is Caesar's tendency to talk about himself in the third person. In other words, to refer to himself as Caesar, which certainly shows a kind of inflated ego. Otherwise, if we look at this in historical context, when we were talking about Cicero several weeks ago, I mentioned that Caesar had sort of run afoul of the ruling oligarchs of Rome. If you go back to the stuff about Michael Hudson and his historical research into the ancient world, that Rome at this point had already essentially become an oligarchy. There were rich landowners and basically financial interests had already more or less taken complete control of society. People were heavily in debt at this point in time, and so Caesar's strategy to win the support of the people was to try to cancel these debts. Now, does that make him a tyrannical figure? I guess it depends on what perspective you have. If you remember, also when I talked about this, in regards to Hudson, Hudson argues that the original Greek tyrants were basically people trying to do the same thing, cancel debts and debt slavery and things like that. So it's interesting how the word tyrant or tyranny has sort of come down to us. I'm not suggesting that contemporary people that we would refer to as a tyrant may not be deserving of that title, and of course the negative connotation that it brings. It is interesting to consider that the original usage of the word tyrant, though, might suggest something fairly drastically different from what we would normally assume. So again, I mean, based on Caesar's actions in the play, I think it's very much a debatable point whether or not he actually deserves to be murdered. I mean, is he an evil figure, or not, or does he show again potential to become that way? So the sort of key theme here is usually seen as this idea of republicanism versus monarchy. Rome was a republic in name at that point in time. Again, all political power had already basically been concentrated among the sort of elite classes within Rome. But it was, at least in theory or on paper, at least, a republic. And this sort of encroachment by Caesar to sort of establish himself as a monarch. Now, Caesar was not actually a monarch, right? He's not actually king of Rome, but he was a general. I think everyone knows that. Very successful and popular Roman general who had aspirations to kingship, essentially, and again was basically cut down before he was able to realize those ambitions. But again, whether or not Caesar would have been a good king or not is a debatable point. Whether he would have been a monarch, which usually means sort of a good ruler or a tyrant. So you could question that, whether or not Caesar would have been a good ruler. The other thing, like I already said, is to what extent was Rome really a republic? As I've already suggested, Rome had already pretty much become an oligarchy. And so maybe the proper way to sort of analyze the competing political forces within Julius Caesar are oligarchy versus tyranny. In other words, two what Aristotle would consider to be sort of, deviant or even perverted forms of government. Now I wrote here in parentheses, China under Xi, which is an interesting thing in that, when you sort of relate this to contemporary politics, many people would argue they're sort of a contemporary political rivalry to this extent developing within China. Xi, of course, is the president of China, who many see as kind of a, maybe another, tyrant in the making, or maybe already a tyrant, one who's already, sort of served in power longer than any other ruler since Mao, who has abolished, term limits on his presidency, who has concentrated, power, more and more power, within himself and within his office, has replaced many of the leading, positions within the Chinese, state with, Xi loyalists. So of course you would assume that is a negative development, right? That China is drifting further and further into a tyrannical form of government. On the other side of things, though, I mean, what are the forces sort of opposing Xi? Well, within China, you do also see this growth of an oligarchy in China as well, within, Chinese billionaires who, there may not be as many as there are in the United States, but are certainly, a growing force, and other extremely wealthy people who've prospered, significantly over the last, several decades of China's economic development. So while the concentration of power under Xi may not be a desirable thing, you have to wonder whether the alternative is really any better. Would it be better if China was an oligarchy, maybe much like the United States, where it's basically, run by a wealthy, out of touch financial and corporate class? I mean, is that a more desirable outcome to have? I think it's very much, a debate worth having, and one which doesn't, I think, really have an easy resolution to itself. And then essentially, and maybe this is going back to what, Shakespeare is even talking about, when we actually have to deal with the reality of our political choices, it may be that neither of them are good. A choice between oligarchy and tyranny is a pretty shitty choice to have to make, but that may in fact be, the choices that we're actually given, at least under, the political circumstances as they exist now. And of course, I think, I mean, that's a fairly obvious thing to say, but, I would also imagine that people are probably more predisposed to, focus more on the idea of a tyrant as being, like the worst form of government. I would argue, while not disagreeing with that sentiment at all, the choice of an oligarchy is not, significantly better either. And that may be the political situation that's developing within China, where basically you have two choices there between an oligarchy or a tyranny. It may be the choices that the Roman citizens had in Julius Caesar's time. It may be the choices that we have here in the United States as well, between a sort of a wannabe tyrant like Donald Trump, and again the aforementioned financial oligarchy, which basically controls the political system here within the United States. So again, neither option is a particularly good one. So the play itself, begins basically just after the power struggle between Caesar and Pompey. And I mentioned that as background info, but also because there are several references to Pompey, where people are sort of, mournful over Pompey's, defeat and death, and seem to, reminisce over these things, or, almost, like I say, are nostalgic for the days where Pompey was still around, still forced to be reckoned with. The irony of that, though, is that if the struggle between Caesar and Pompey had worked out differently, and Pompey won over Caesar, Pompey would probably be in their eyes at least just as bad as Caesar. So it kind of says something, I guess, about how people are nostalgic over things, not realizing that if these things actually came to be, they would probably not be happy with it either. that if Pompey won this power struggle between him and Caesar, that they would basically be saying the same things about Pompey and probably saying the same things about Caesar, sort of mourning his loss. Again, as I already said, Republican institutions had already severely decayed and atrophied by this point. Rome was a republic, essentially in name only. In name only, in reality, again, most political power had already sort of been concentrated at the top. Now, what are the consequences of Caesar's murder? If you murder a tyrant, you would assume that is a good thing, right? You're removing a bad political actor. But how does this play out within the play itself? Not really in a good way, although that's what we're really going over the first 3 acts, which sort of, climaxes in Caesar's murder. We have yet to really see the aftermath of what happens in acts 4 and 5. But spoiler alert for a 400-year-old play that's based on real historical events, it doesn't exactly turn out well. So the murder of Caesar does not really lead to a good outcome either. So that's something important to keep in mind, as well as the rationalizations given by Brutus and by others as to the correctness of their course of actions. I mean the outcome of Caesar's murder would seem to contradict what they're saying as well, especially Brutus, of course. Now, and that also goes into what are the motivations of the conspirators who kill Caesar. Brutus is probably the only one that you can maybe say has somewhat noble intentions here. But even though he loves Caesar, he sees Caesar as a threat to the Republic, and even those motivations are not entirely clear, and only seems to reference that a few times. The others, Cassius and all the other leading figures in the conspiracy to murder Caesar, seem to be more motivated by envy. I mean, they're simply jealous of Caesar, jealous of his power, jealous of his popularity, and want to remove him for that reason, as well as the fact that again they are oligarchs basically, and maybe see Caesar as a threat to their sort of oligarchic power and control. Now, I think another important theme within the play is the importance of rhetoric, the sort of art of persuasive speaking, and we see this at several points during the course of the play, right? I mean, speakers are able to convince or persuade people to do things based upon rhetoric, and you see, of course, one extremely famous example of this. But Cassius, I would say, somewhat easily sways Brutus to their cause, to bring him into the conspiracy to kill Caesar. He certainly sways him. Does he do it easily? I would say so. I would say it does not seem to take a whole lot of convincing on the part of Cassius to get Brutus, to sort of win Brutus over to his side. Brutus does have, of course, some reservations about it, but I don't think it's that hard to sort of get him, over to their side. Another example of this is when Decius convinces Caesar to come to the Senate. Caesar originally says that he's not going to go. This is in Act 2. His wife, in a very famous part of the play as well, tells him about this prophetic dream that she's having, that she's seeing visions of all sorts of ominous, signs. And she, initially convinces Caesar not to go. But Decius sort of is able to persuade him again to come to the Senate, which of course is where he will meet his ultimate demise, by appealing to his vanity, by appealing to his lust for power. He basically tells them, come to the Senate. They're ready to crown you, and that sort of wins him over. Interestingly enough, he also sort of reinterprets Calpurnia's dream. Calpurnia being Caesar's wife. That no, that may sound bad. This image of a statue in a fountain, spewing blood. Which you would think is self-evidently a very ominous thing. He actually persuades Caesar to think, no, that's actually a good thing. That's actually a good sign that your blood is going to revive Rome or something like that, which is kind of crazy. But again, he's able to persuade him. Now, I think, of course, the most famous example is Mark Antony swaying the crowd, which I'll get to in a moment. But at the very least, in these examples, Cassius and Brutus and Decius and Caesar, it's interesting how the persuasion works, right? Because they're persuading them, but they're not getting them to do something that I think is completely against their will. So it's more, they're not making them do something that is completely contrary to their will. It's something that maybe they secretly desire, but they can't really sort of acknowledge it or admit it to themselves, or there's kind of social norms sort of preventing them from sort of acting on their desires. So the rhetoric in this instance is able to sort of get them to kind of rationalize, right? Sort of get them to sort of allow them to rationalize violating certain social norms in order to do what they really want. If you're assuming that Brutus maybe deep down wants to kill Caesar, and Caesar certainly wants to be crowned king, they're able to sort of persuade them to do things which they want to do. So I think that's important aspect to consider in terms of rhetoric, right? You can persuade people up to a point, but I don't know if you can necessarily persuade people to do something that's completely against their will. Maybe if they secretly want to do it, or on some level want to do something, then you can persuade them if you're able to sort of give them a way to sort of circumvent maybe some of the social norms or obstacles which may basically prevent them from acting on things. And of course, again, the most important, the most famous example of rhetoric in the play is Mark Antony being able to sway the masses, which I'll talk about in more detail later on when we get to that point. But basically, the crowd, when Brutus first announces that he's killed Caesar, the crowd supports them, and Antony's able to basically get them to completely turn, do a 180, basically get mad at Brutus and the other conspirators for murdering Caesar. Anyway, so I think another important, and also sort of expanding on this theme of language here, is I think the way in which language is used in this play says a lot about social class as well. So, and this is pretty much true of all of Shakespeare's plays, but they're mostly written in verse, in what we call iambic pentameter, which is sort of 5 repeating stressed and unstressed syllables. So you start with an unstressed syllable, and then stress the second syllable, and then basically repeat that 5 times during the course of the line. It establishes a very interesting, and I guess you'd say fairly pleasant sort of rhythm to the way in which the characters speak. And most of Shakespeare's plays are written in this way. It's not perfect iambic pentameter, meaning it doesn't always follow 5 feet, as it's called. Iam is a Greek word for foot, so it doesn't necessarily follow that 5 stressed and unstressed syllables for every line, but does for most of them. But there are other parts of the play that are written in prose, that are not written in this kind of poetic verse. And it's interesting, the sort of social designations for when characters are speaking in verse and speaking in prose. Commoners, basically, like the cobbler in the very first scene, speaks in prose. The easy way in which you can see this is when the lines of dialogue basically go all the way across the page. They're speaking in prose. When it's the short lines that looks like it's written like a poem, then they're speaking in verse. So again, most of the time, the characters are speaking in verse. But commoners speak in prose. However, when the nobles, and most of the characters in this play basically have a kind of aristocratic origin to them. When the nobles, like when Brutus, for example, addresses the crowd later on in the play, he's speaking in prose. So when they speak to the commoners, they speak in prose, or when a commoner is speaking, they speak in prose. When they're addressing each other, though, they speak in verse, in this kind of iambic pentameter flow. And and you know, it does, like I said, establish a very kind of, you know, poetic rhythm. Um, it's astounding to think sometimes, but you know, even if Shakespeare never wrote a single play in his lifetime, like he would still go down in history as one of the most important poets of all time, right? The so-called Shakespearean sonnets, which you know we're not covering here in this class, but of course are worth reading in their own right. And like many of Shakespeare's plays, also have their kind of cryptic references to them as well. It's been a while since I've read any of the Shakespeare's sonnets, but I know, you know, the references to the so-called dark lady, or things that people focus on a lot, and other sort of references like that. So Shakespeare obviously is a master of writing in verse as well as in prose. Now the one example, or the one exception to this, which I admittedly find somewhat confusing, is when Casca in Act 1, Scene 2 is speaking to Brutus and to Cassius. He speaks to them in prose. Brutus even refers to him at, you know, he calls him a blunt fellow. And then Cassius seems to suggest that he's sort of putting this on, that he's kind of like, I guess, playing dumb, essentially. Which is odd, because then in the following scene, when he's speaking to Cicero, when Casca is speaking to Cicero, he's speaking in verse. So Casca can speak in verse. Why does he choose to speak in prose to Cassius and Brutus? Why is he, if he is, you know, putting on an act, why is he actually doing that? The other thing I can think of, and I have to admit, I thought about this for a little while. You know, the best interpretation I can come of it, at least, is that because he doesn't know if Brutus is sort of in with them, if Brutus is going to join them in his conspiracy, he's sort of playing dumb to a certain extent. And it's only when he realizes that Brutus is down, you know, is down with them, basically, that he, you know, later on, that he starts to speak to them as he does to the others. Now Cicero is also not a part of the conspiracy, but he's sympathetic to the cause. In fact, in real life, you know, since Cicero wrote in his letters, in his personal correspondence, that essentially, you know, he wished that he could have been there. You know, he wished that he could have been there to see Caesar die, and possibly also to actually have participated in the murder itself. I mean, you know, I'd be you know, interested to hear what other people have to think about that. But that's the best interpretation I can think of. Why Casca speaks prose in one scene, and then verse in another. That he's essentially playing dumb because he's not sure if Brutus is going to join with them. Now, you know, a little bit of the political context of the play. The play was first performed, or it's believed to have, you know, first been performed in 1599. There's a lot of political turmoil during the period of time. I guess there's always political turmoil, but specifically, what was the political turmoil about during this period of time? Well, this is very near the end of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, who in fact died in 1603. After she dies, James I becomes king, who's considered to be much more of a tyrannical ruler. I hesitate to call Elizabeth or any monarch a good monarch, but I guess by the standards of monarchs, I guess she's supposed to be one of the better ones. Or at least, you know, again, a sort of unifying, you know, figure, a symbolic figure that sort of binds the kingdom together. But anyway, after her death, James I becomes king, much more of a tyrannical ruler. After his death, Charles I becomes king, who was, you know, probably one of the worst kings in England. I mean, he ends up being executed, in fact, which I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but certainly, you know, the idea of, you know, the political decay of a monarchy, the idea of people sort of, you know, seizing power. I think there was a lot of fear that after Elizabeth died, that somebody else might try to, you know, usurp power and things like that. Those certainly seem to be themes that sort of work their way within Julius Caesar as well. Now, you know, the change of setting from England to Rome may have been in many ways motivated by censorship. Shakespeare, in fact, had just completed Henry V, which completed a long, you know, cycle of historical dramas. He had written about English kings in the preceding decade, you know, during the course of the 1590s. many of them, examining the monarchy in a critical way, you could say, at least to a certain extent. And so perhaps it was, advantageous for Shakespeare to basically, change the setting from England to Rome as to avoid censorship, which was apparently sort of, increasing during this period of time as well. Like I already said, there were, significant fears over who would succeed Elizabeth after her death. I guess now fairly famous, the gunpowder plot happens in 1605. Guy Fawkes, who's been, popularized by the movie and graphic novel V for Vendetta. The guy basically tried to blow up Parliament, although he was not acting alone. I mean, this occurs, just a few years after Julius Caesar's first performed, and basically just a couple of years after Elizabeth dies. Which is always, Guy Fawkes Day has been a recognized, holiday in England. It's just a strange holiday, of course, although it's been, I don't know how the government, recognizes that holiday, but it is something that people within England recognize for a very long time. The whole Guy Fawkes thing, happened, fairly recently, right? V for Vendetta, the graphic novel, comes out in the 1980s, actually written by Alan Moore, who's also the author of From Hell, who I mentioned in previous classes. As much as I would like to credit the graphic novel for that popularity of that Guy Fawkes mask, in becoming a thing, and anti-globalization protests, things like that. I don't think you can really honestly say that happens though until basically after the movie comes out. I think around 2005 or 2006 or so. But basically since then, this image of Guy Fawkes, or the Guy Fawkes mask at least, has become a very sort of iconic thing. Anyway, so the original event, which this is based upon, sort of happens within this kind of political context, as I'm saying. Now it's somewhat further removed from this, but you have the English Civil War between 1642 and 1651, a very bloody affair within English history, which again essentially culminates or climaxes with the the execution of the English king Charles I and the brief abdication of the English monarchy. Right? To this very day, everyone knows about the British royal family, even though they now basically largely serve in a symbolic role. But there was a brief period of time where they actually did abolish, not abdicate, that's the word, but they did actually abolish the monarchy for a brief period of time, for about a decade or so. And then they brought it back, which of course it's existed since then. But the English Civil War is an extremely bloody affair. And even though it happens about 40 years later, you could certainly argue, connecting this to things like the gunpowder plot and things like that, there was certainly a sort of growing, sentiment, I think you could say, a growing movement, a growing, resentment against the monarchy, against the British upper class as a whole. There was a movement, a kind of Republican movement within England during this period of time. And I think all of that probably was already, evident in Shakespeare's day. I'm sure he was certainly aware of that to a certain extent. Marlowe, his close friend, was even sort of more, sort of plugged into that. And I think that's actually what got Marlowe killed. I think it was like killed in a fight or something like that. But for largely, because of his sort of interest or sort of involvement in political affairs during this period of time. Now, outside of England, you have the 30 Years' War in Europe from 1618 to 1648, an extremely significant event, one which gets often overlooked, but just a horrible, bloody war in Europe. I think it's estimated, something like between like 4 and 8 million people died during the course of this war. Mostly fought within Central Europe, within Germany, and that part of Europe for the most part. But the entire continent was involved to some extent. I believe James I was sort of indirectly supporting these sort of Catholic factions. It's largely considered to be a religious war, though I think there are underlying social class tensions underlying that as well. But I believe that James I at least indirectly supported some of the Catholic factions there. The end of this war culminates in the Peace of Westphalia, which anyone who studies international relations know this is an important moment. This is essentially where the concept of European, sovereignty gets sort of worked out for the first time. The idea that, nation, which essentially creates the concept of nation states, that there are national boundaries, that within these boundaries, one government is sovereign. States can't, violate the sovereignty of other states. Some scholars debate that. They would argue that the concept of national sovereignty actually emerges later on. But at least the conventional understanding is that this is where this sort of concept originates from. And then many years later, you have the so-called Glorious Revolution in England in 1689. Glorious because it was supposedly a non-bloody, non-violent affair. I don't think that's entirely true, although I guess it was relatively non-violent, at least as far as revolutions go. Now, when Edmund Burke later on condemns the French Revolution in the 1790s, so we're a long way off from Shakespeare now at this point, but I think the historical context here is still important. He references the so-called bloodless revolution, the Glorious Revolution in England. Now, what Burke neglects to talk about, though, is the extremely bloody English Civil War, which was just only about 40 years prior to that. So you could certainly argue that the extremely violent English Civil War sort of set the stage for the more non-violent Glorious Revolution of 1689. In other words, I don't think it's exactly appropriate to sort of take credit, as Burke does, to sort of compare essentially that the British way of reform was the more beneficial path to follow than the revolutionary path of the French during this point in time. It's sort of based on a very sort of selective reading of history, which tends to, like I said, you have to kind of ignore the extremely violent English Civil War to make that case. And it does, of course, raise an important question, since political violence is one of the key themes here. To what extent is violence a necessary tool of political change? Of course, our liberal sensibilities would bias us to saying, oh no, of course not, nonviolent change is the best way. And of course, that's what we all want to believe. The historical record seems to show otherwise, though. It's kind of hard to ignore the fact that violence has played in leading to real political changes. And again, I would argue that all these things were certainly evident, at least in some form, maybe even in a kind of prototypical embryonic form during Shakespeare's days. But again, I mean, the fact that there was a major attempt against the British state, during Shakespeare's own lifetime, I think would suggest maybe these were, more than just an embryonic thing, something that was actually, existing during Shakespeare's day, which continued to grow in the decades following that. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say about that. I feel like there is. But so again, the monarchy is briefly abolished. It's brought back. All right. Well, anyway, so going on to Burke's theme about sort of critiquing the violence of the French Revolution. There's a quote from, or actually a passage from Mark Twain, which I always think of in regards to this, which I think is very interesting. This is from Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, sort of one of Twain's lesser novels, but has some interesting points in it. So he says here, speaking of what he calls, the two reigns of terror, the one that we all know about in the French Revolution from about 1793 to 1794, 1792 to 1794, that ends with the death of Robespierre. But Twain says, no, actually there were two, and we only seem to pay attention to one. So again, as he writes here, he says, there were two reigns of terror, if we would but remember it and consider it. The one wrought murder and hot passion, meaning the reign of terror that we associate with the Jacobins. The other in heartless cold blood. The one lasted mere months. The other had lasted 1,000 years. The one inflicted death upon 10,000 persons. The other upon 100 millions. But our shudders are all for the horrors of the minor terror, the momentary terror, so to speak. Whereas what is the horror of swift death by the axe compared with lifelong death from hunger, cold, insult, cruelty, and heartbreak? What is swift death by lightning compared with death by slow fire at the stake? A city cemetery could contain the coffins filled by that brief terror, which we have all been so diligently taught to shiver at and mourn over. But all France could hardly contain the coffins filled by that older and real terror, that unspeakably bitter and awful terror, which none of us has been taught to see in its vastness or pity as it deserves. So I think it's clear what Twain is trying to get across here. Yeah, Jerome?
So I wanted to know, would you say that the terror and Robespierre in general were a posteriori depicted as monsters, and that conservative people after the French Revolution picture them as more evil than they really were?
Do I think that the way the Jacobins were portrayed are evil? The people see them as being evil now? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because once I heard somebody saying that there was an historical process of depicting Robespierre and Jacobins as monsters, and I wanted to know what you thought about it, that the terror was very terrific and that it deserved its reputation, or that it was exaggerated afterwards. What do you think about that?
Well, I pretty much agree with what Twain is saying here. Is that, I mean, what he's suggesting is that the violence of the terror, which I think was a violent moment in history, is not understandable without realizing what he says. The 1,000 years of terror basically preceding it, that the violence sort of unleashed by the French Revolution, which was not a uniformly violent event. I mean, it was a very complex event. So there are moments, prior to that where there were attempts at, I mean, the original intentions of the revolutionary leaders what was, I think, at least very early on, to establish a kind of constitutional monarchy. It was really, the treachery of the French king, who was, repeatedly trying to sabotage what was going on. I think, up to, trying to flee the country, I think sort of pushed them into that to a certain extent. You also had the fact that, basically all of Europe had mobilized, the ruling classes of Europe had mobilized against the revolution and were, basically, at the beginning, I think in 1792, again, launched, an invasion of France, on multiple sides. So certainly that contributed, I think, to a large extent as to what was going on. But yeah, I would say what Twain is saying here makes a lot of sense in that we are biased into focusing on the spectacle of violence surrounding the so-called reign of terror, but we're sort of blind to the immensely greater human suffering that transpired for a much longer period of time preceding that, and which in many ways contributed to that violence, because of the sort of wretchedness and horrible, miserable conditions that the people in France were subjected to leading up to that event, and which had gotten extremely bad in the years preceding the revolution. So no, I don't think that they're monsters. I mean, I think that they have to, again, like all things, be sort of understood in the historical context. And I would say that, yeah, in many ways, I would say they were sort of pushed into that by circumstances that were sort of outside their control.
Thank you.
Yeah, and again, I would I read out this passage because I think this is still true to this very day. I would still argue that most people probably see the French Revolution the way that Burke saw it, which is, say, from a very sort of conservative, reactionary point of view, which is based on so many flaws. Like I said, even in Burke's own view of British politics, he has to basically sort of ignore the English Civil War to sort of praise the glorious Revolution of 1689. Maybe the reason why the Revolution of 1689 was relatively nonviolent, and again, I'm not even, I don't think it was completely nonviolent, but maybe relatively nonviolent, was possibly because they had already seen what had happened just, a few years prior to that, or a couple of decades prior to that. Maybe they were like, all right, well, we better just leave now, essentially, or we're gonna have another civil war on our hands. Yeah, Jerome.
Well, what I can tell from my perspective is that in France, well, the first part of like the French Revolution, the 1789 part is, well, it's a very important national event, so basically it's very consensual. The part of the terror, though, it's kind of contrasted. You have people on the far left, actual politicians, who are really trying to, you know, not protect, but to depict that as an important part of political history. But there are also of people, and that's the way it was taught to me in school, that the terror was a step, a wrong step, one of the point where things went awry. So I would say that in France there is a real debate about the legacy of the terror.
Yeah, sure. And like I said, I mean, I think you can't just isolate it. I think you have to look at it in the overall context. I mean, which takes on many different aspects to it. The years immediately preceding the revolution, what Twain calls the 1,000 years basically leading up to it, the much greater terror, as he says. Even like I said, the first couple of years of the revolution after, or beginning in 1789 and after, I mean, it wasn't right off the bat an extremely violent event. That the sort of violence, what people refer to as the reign of terror, basically happened, within a couple of years into that, which again, I think you have to look at, again, the behavior of the French monarch, the French ruling class, who were, basically, so, France is basically fighting a civil war against the former aristocrats, as well as a foreign war. You have other countries forming these grand coalitions, or whatever they're called, the Grand Alliance, to crush the revolution. Well, when you're being literally attacked on all sides like that, I mean, it tends to lead to things like this, and you got people sort of acting in a life or death situation here, trying to prevent their own deaths, as well as prevent the political changes from being turned backwards. And then of course you have the years after the terror as well, leading up to Napoleon's rise to power. So as well as I would also say, now with the advantage of hindsight, you can also say, well, what were the consequences? What were the overall consequences of it? I mean, Burke predicts that France is just going to completely collapse within itself and become just this nonstop fighting and civil war and deprivation and suffering. I mean, that's not really the case within France, right? I mean, France has generally a standard of living which is envied by many people, and I would say that in no small part, I mean, I think the continued history of revolutionary politics plays a role in that, not just within the events between 1789 to 1799, but the Revolution of 1848, the Paris Commune, the general strikes in 1968, and various other events as well. I think it's not a coincidence that France generally has again, a very high standard of living, at least compared to many other countries. I don't think it's a coincidence that they have that standard of living and also have a very revolutionary politics. I would say that the revolutionary politics are a big part why there is a higher standard of living there. That's not to say that France is a perfect society either, obviously. But I'm just saying, relative to other countries, I mean, that certainly seems to be the case. So I would say that Burke is wrong. I mean, he was his own reading of history is very selective. France did not go down the path that he thought it would. I mean, it seems to have thrived and prospered, not in spite of its revolutionary politics, but I would say largely because of its revolutionary politics. So I think he's completely. And again, these kind of radical revolutionary politics were also evident within Shakespeare's day as well. No, it's certainly not perfect at all. But compared to standards of living within the United States and, again, many other countries, I mean, there are lots of things that, seem beneficial there. All right, so that's so much for the political context. Another thing I want to talk about is the connection between Orson Welles and Shakespeare, which I think is a very interesting one. One, I mean, Welles himself staged a very famous performance of Julius Caesar on stage in the late 1930s, where he sort of reinterpreted, not sort of, he did reinterpret it basically as an anti-fascist drama. And I have a couple of examples of it. Unfortunately, there's no surviving footage of it. This was not a movie. This was, performed on stage. The only real record of it, I think, are just a few still photos like that. There's Welles himself playing Brutus. I forget the actor's name who plays Caesar off the top of my head. But Brutus is the big, role, the most important role. Caesar himself, actually really isn't in the play, all that much. He kind of plays sort of a minor role within the play. I mean, Brutus's role is much more important. Here's another still photo, which is kind of interesting, the way it's photographed. You get a glimpse of how the scenery and the stage would have looked, which I believe was designed by Welles largely. I mean, he didn't work on these things completely himself, but he was acting and directing the play, and I think had a big role in a lot of the other production aspects as well. So it's an interesting idea to sort of reinterpret the play, in the context of the 1930s, in the struggle against fascism. Now, some people criticize that, and I could understand their argument for doing so, because it removes a lot of the ambiguity of Shakespeare's play. Again, as I said, I mean, it's not quite clear where Shakespeare's the sympathies lie. Is Caesar a tyrant? Does Caesar deserve to die? What are the intentions of the conspirators? I mean, other than Brutus, at least, the rest of them seem to have very self-interested motives for wanting Caesar dead. So there's a lot of, like I said, ambiguity there regarding the murder of Caesar. When you reinterpret it in that way, so that Caesar's now Mussolini or something like that, or even Hitler, all that ambiguity kind of goes away, and it becomes very clear that Caesar's the bad guy, basically. Caesar's the tyrant. Caesar should be killed. So I could understand that argument, although I think it is a very interesting thing to reinterpret Shakespeare in that way. And of course, there are many there are more interpretations of Shakespeare than I could possibly count. As far as movies and live theatrical performances go. Some of them follow the original setting, some of them reinterpret it, into different settings. And I think all those things are interesting to do. Some are more successful than others. For example, when I was younger, there was a reinterpretation of Romeo and Juliet with Leonardo DiCaprio. They were sort of set in kind of like a modern setting. It was a very popular movie at the time. I couldn't stand it. I don't think I ever actually saw it or saw the whole thing. So some, definitely work better than others. And I don't think it's a very critically acclaimed, version of Romeo and Juliet either. Although, like I said, it was very, very popular. This was actually Titanic Leonardo DiCaprio also. So this is kind of one of his most important roles, prior to that movie. But like I said, many different interpretations of Shakespeare. Wells's interpretation, I think, is very interesting. Wells also staged an adaptation of Macbeth, also during this period of time, during the 1930s, with an all African American cast. It's been nicknamed Voodoo Macbeth because the setting was changed to Haiti instead of Scotland, obviously. So Wells was, definitely doing a lot of interesting things with Shakespeare. Again, this is prior to him directing any movies. This was when he was basically, directing plays in the 1930s. His movie career would begin in the 1940s, although he would, continue to do, have at least one foot in the theatrical world as well. I have a few more things to say about Wells, but I think it's also worth noting that another famous actor from this period of time, Paul Robeson, who's actually a Rutgers alumni. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of him, and an actor, well known for his radical politics as well. Wells was generally considered to be a left wing figure. Robeson also starred as Othello on Broadway in the 1940s. Actually, first playing him in London in the 1930s, but then sort of reprising the role on Broadway in New York in the 1940s. Directed by Margaret Webster, who's a very famous theatrical director in her own right. Now, according to what I was reading, this version of Othello is actually the longest running performance of a Shakespearean play in Broadway history. I think it ran for 296 nights or something like that, which apparently is far beyond any other live version of Shakespeare, at least performed on Broadway. I mean, London's a bit different, but so that's very notable. Another thing worth mentioning, I think, is another sort of attempt maybe to dramatize Rome in the political context of the 1930s and 40s against in the fight against fascism, or in the struggle against fascism, is Albert Camus' play Caligula, which is a very interesting play at all. Caligula being one of the more infamous Roman emperors, who again, you can interpret it in different ways. You can more strictly in an existentialist view of Caligula is just this figure trying to sort of achieve an impossible idea of freedom and doing very horrible things in the process of it. When I read the play, and I think it in college, and the way that it was presented to me as a college student, was that this was very much a political thing, that Caligula is kind of like a totalitarian leader. So I think the connection between that and Wells's interpretation of Caesar as an anti-fascist play, I think, is interesting. So Wells is a very interesting figure, and kind of an underrated interpreter of Shakespeare also, I would say. When you think of adaptations of Shakespeare, most people probably think of Laurence Olivier, maybe more modern Kenneth Branagh, who's sort of still around doing Shakespearean adaptations, and even played Shakespeare in a recent movie, which it was pretty good. I haven't seen it though. Yeah, Drew?
What do you think about the modern interpretation of Macbeth, in which is set in Romania?
I'm not familiar with that one.
So it's a recent one with Patrick Stewart as Macbeth, and it's supposed to transplant the tragedy of Macbeth into Ceausescu regime in Romania or something like that.
Oh, really?
So it's interesting.
Yeah, sounds interesting. I mean, again, this just, I think, speaks to the continued relevance of Shakespeare, and that Shakespeare is not just a literary figure who writes pretty words, but had a real in-depth knowledge of politics and history, and the political themes within Shakespeare are still very relevant now, and I would say lends itself very easily to adaptations like this. Patrick Stewart also played Othello, and I haven't seen it, but I was reading about it. But they did something where he's a white actor, obviously, playing Othello, who's a Moor or black, depending on your definition of Moor from Northern Africa. But the rest of the cast is black. So it's sort of like inverting what happens within Othello. Othello being a black character, with interacting with white characters. Now you have Othello being played by a white man, but the rest of the cast is black. I'm not sure exactly what the point of that is. But Patrick Stewart's a great actor, obviously. So, I'd be interested in anything he does. I was not aware of this version of Macbeth that he did, but that sounds very interesting as well. Roman Polanski also did an adaptation of Macbeth as a movie in the 1970s, which apparently I have not seen either, but I've heard that's one of the better versions as well. Really sort of emphasizes the kind of sort of like squalor of that era. You know, even though Macbeth is a king or becomes a king, you know, the castle that he inhabits is, you know, run down and dirty, and they're, you know, like pigs running around and things like that. So that's an interesting version as well. Anyway, though, going back to Wells, I would say that Wells is kind of an underrated, I would say, interpreter of Shakespeare. Maybe not the first person that people think of, but maybe should at least be within the, you know, in the conversation. And personally speaking, I mean, I'm much more of a fan of Wells than I am of Laurence Olivier, so I would probably even put Wells first, but that's my own bias. Anyway, besides his theatrical adaptations on stage, you know, he did do film versions of Macbeth and Othello, as well as a later movie called Chimes at Midnight, which kind of blends together different aspects of Shakespeare's historical dramas about Henry IV and Henry V. What was I going to say about that? Well, all right. Does anyone know anything about Wells or have seen any of his movies? He's probably most well known for the movie Citizen Kane, which I think is probably a movie that people have heard about, but not many people have actually watched, at least based upon, you know, what talking about this with other people. That seems to be the case. And Citizen Kane is a great movie, and certainly is a movie, you know, worth watching. I mean, for many years it had the reputation of being, you know, it was often called the greatest movie ever made, which I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I mean, I think when you call a movie something like that, you know, you're almost inevitably, you know, inviting a kind of backlash or reaction against that. I think that backlash has already kind of set into to a certain extent. I don't know if it's the greatest movie ever made. I mean, it is a great movie. It's definitely worth watching. But the thing about that, though, is that for people that have, you know, heard of Wells or at least heard of Citizen Kane, but may not have even seen it, is that movie then tends to overshadow Wells's other work. And I would say that not only is Citizen Kane a great movie, but Wells's entire filmography is great. Quite frankly, I think all of his movies are great, and I would really, you know, encourage people if they ever have a chance to watch them if you haven't. I think he only did maybe 12 completed feature-length films, which is not a whole lot. He did a lot of short films. He did a lot of incomplete films that he started but was never able to complete, usually due to financial reasons. But I think I've pretty much seen all of his full-length feature films, except for Macbeth and Othello, interestingly enough. But yeah, I would say all of his movies are great. They're all worth watching. Chimes at Midnight, some people say that's his true masterpiece. Came out in the 1960s, so about 25 years after Citizen Kane. I know Wells himself considered that to be his favorite film. Now, if you're interested in Shakespeare, and it'd certainly be a good film to watch. What was I going to say about that? So, all right, so, you know, Wells was also basically sort of caught up in the Hollywood blacklist as well. You know, the sort of, you know, banning of people from working within Hollywood, you know, in the late 1940s, basically up until the 1960s. And there's some debate over to what extent, you know, Wells was blacklisted. He continued, I guess, to find work as an actor, but found it incredibly hard to be able to direct films. In fact, many of his later films, you know, from the late 1940s and after, were basically done overseas. Many of them in Europe. So, like I said, you know, what was generally considered to be a sort of, you know, left-wing figure, communist sympathies and all that. Although, as I think is pretty well known now, you know, the Hollywood blacklist era and the McCarthy era drastically, you know, over-exaggerated the so-called, you know, communist leanings that many of these people had. I mean, being a communist in the 1940s was basically like being like, you know, a left-leaning liberal, you know, essentially in many ways. Certainly not, you know, people who were, you know, advocating, you know, the overthrow of the United States government. Not for the most part, at least. Dalton Trumbo, yes, would be another example of that. Actually, last year, 2022, marked the 75th anniversary of the Hollywood blacklist. Right, began basically in 1947. People usually make a big deal of these, nickel and dime anniversaries, 5 and 10 year anniversaries. Didn't really seem to see many people talking about that, but certainly a very noticeable noteworthy thing. 75 years since the Hollywood blacklist. Yeah, and people like Dalton Trumbo were caught up in it. Some, like I said, Wells less explicitly. Was he blacklisted? Was he not blacklisted? There seems to be some debate over that. I think many people would agree that, yeah, he certainly had a harder time finding work. But it also could have been because, many of his films were considered financially unsuccessful, including Citizen Kane, which apparently was, if you know anything about the movie, something that, loosely based on the life of William Randolph Hearst. Hearst apparently caught wind of that and put all his resources basically to, go against the film, which apparently was successful. So, not having a financially successful film certainly helps. Although some of his later films, like The Stranger, which is more conventional movie, but still a great movie in its own right, was also was a successful movie. Anyway, I don't want to get too caught off guard talking about Wells. Obviously, I'm a big fan. I spent a lot of time talking about him. But part of the reason why I am a fan is because I think his adaptations of Shakespeare are very interesting. I feel like there's something else I want to say about it, but all right. So here's Julius Caesar. Here's a movie poster from Chimes at Midnight. You see him here playing Falstaff. So Wells became sort of, a legendary figure for, being a very, heavyset guy. Was a big eater. Oh, that's the other thing I want to say. So Wells has also gotten the reputation of being kind of a megalomaniac or something like that. And there is almost like a kind of like, even now, a kind of like character assassination against Wells, which I think is very, at least as far as I can tell, obviously I never knew him, but it seems to be undeserved for the most part, at least by other people that knew Wells fairly well or worked with him. He was not a horrible prick or anything like that. I think why I'm mentioning that is I think it's interesting that apparently his reputation for being hard to work with stems from his interactions with a lot of movie executives. As did another actor, Marlon Brando, who also did, is in a very famous movie adaptation of Julius Caesar, by the way, which is worth watching. But it seems that their reputation for being hard to work with largely stems from their dealings with movie executives. And as far as I can tell, from what I've read about it, at least, seems that they were, people who had some artistic integrity, sort of, struggling against the sort of crass commercialism of the movie executives. And I think if that's how they get labeled to be hard to work with, then I think it's definitely something that should be re-evaluated. I wish there was more integrity within artistic integrity within the movie industry. Now, if you look at the crappy movies that come out, clearly the executives won. So like I said, Wells is a very interesting figure, worth examining more, especially his movies. Now, Falstaff, or Chimes at Midnight, is also known by Falstaff, where he plays the famous Shakespearean character Sir John Falstaff. Like I said, sort of a loose adaptation of scenes from what is known in Shakespearean literature as the Henriad, the sort of what is it? A tetralogy, these 4 plays: Richard II, Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, and Henry V, who are among Shakespeare's most important plays, or most well-known plays, especially Henry V. I'd like to read something from Henry IV, which I think is one of the more interesting passages from Shakespeare. But anyway, yeah, if you've never seen it, go watch this movie. It's a very interesting adaptation. It's not a straight adaptation of any one of these plays. It sort of combines dialogue and it combines scenes from all these plays, and sort of revolves around Falstaff, as well as Henry V, Prince Hal, who becomes Henry V. Now, the thing that's interesting about that is that Henry V's father, who becomes king, Henry IV, is a usurper. Henry IV kills Richard II and basically takes the throne by force. Another, relevant theme for what we're talking about here in class. Now, his son, Prince Hal, who later becomes Henry V, one of the most famous kings of England, what's interesting about that is that he's not groomed for kingship at a very young age. When you first encounter Prince Hal, he's kind of a juvenile delinquent, basically. He's out, fucking around with Falstaff, drinking, doing all sorts of no good things, carousing. They even do robberies and stuff like that. And it's the idea that he was not, because his father took the throne by force, he was not from a very early age being sort of groomed for kingship. He was just kind of this, lost soul, basically. But, if you go through the whole, sequence of plays, he eventually sort of, evolves into this, supposedly great king. Again, I have a hard time saying any king is great, but, again, at least by the standards of the day, is considered a great king. Anyway, if I can switch gears here for a second, there's a very famous part from King Henry IV, which I want to read. So now I'll try to read a little bit of Shakespeare. I'm trying not to butcher it too badly. Trying not to stutter over all my words. This is from again Henry IV, Part 1, Act 3, Scene 1. One of the most interesting characters in Shakespeare is this character Hotspur, who is sort of a rival to Prince Hal. And he's with Mortimer, who is sort of the rightful king of England. Should have succeeded the throne after the death of Richard II. But again, the throne was basically usurped by Henry IV. So this is the faction that's basically opposing Henry IV and his son, who later becomes Henry V. And there's a funny and interesting interaction between Hotspur and this other guy, Glendower, who's, I believe, a Welsh rebel who's sort of also opposing the king, but for different reasons. And so Hotspur and Glendower don't really like each other, and they have this very interesting exchange here. So I'll try to read it. These promises are fair, the parties sure, and our induction full of prosperous hope. Lord Mortimer and cousin Glendower, will you sit down? And Uncle Worcester, a plague upon it, I have forgot the map. No, here it is. Sit, cousin Percy, sit, good cousin Hotspur. For by that name, as oft as Lancaster doth speak of you, his cheeks look pale, and with a rising sigh, he wisheth you in heaven, and you in hell, as oft as he hears Owen Glendower spoke of. So if it's not quite clear, these guys don't really like each other, and they're kind of competing against each other, even though they're doing it in sort of at least starts off sort of a passive-aggressive way. He's saying, Glendower's, sit down, calm down, basically. Every time he thinks of you, he wishes you weren't here, basically. And Hotspur says, go to hell, basically. And here's where things start to, heat up a little bit more between them. He says, I cannot blame him. At my nativity, the front of heaven was full of fiery shapes, of burning cressets, and at my birth, the frame and huge foundation of the earth shake like a coward. So Glendower was basically like bragging. He's saying, I'm such a badass, basically, that when I was born, the earth itself reacted to it, basically. The earth shook when I was born. Kind of reminds me almost of like a rap battle or something like that, where they're sort of like going back and forth, trying to, outdo each other. So he goes on, Hotspur, he says, why so it would have done at the same season if your mother's cat had but kitten, though yourself had never been born. So he's saying, it's not a big deal. I'm not going to interpret everything, but just sort of set the stage here for what's going on here. So he's like, yeah, I'm a badass. The earth shook when I was born. He's like, yeah, it would have done it if your mom's cat had kittens, basically. I say the earth did shake when I was born, and I say the earth was not of my mind. If you suppose as fearing you, it shook. The earth is not afraid of you, basically. The heavens were all on fire. The earth did tremble. Oh, then the earth shook to see the heavens on fire, and not in fear of your nativity, Diseased nature oftentimes breaks forth in strange eruptions off the teeming earth, is with a kind of colic pinched and vexed by the imprisoning of unruly winds within her womb, which for enlargement striving shakes the old bedlam earth and topples down steeples and moss-grown towers at your birth. Our grandam earth having this distemperate nature and passion shook. So basically saying, like, when the earth shook, it was, like the earth farted, basically, when you were born. It wasn't shaking out of fear. Cousin of many men, I do not bear these crossings. Give me leave to tell you once again that at my birth, the front of heaven was full of fiery shapes. The goats ran from the mountains, and the herds were strangely clamorous to the frighted fields. These signs have marked me extraordinary, and all the courses of my life do show I am not in the roll of common men. Where is he living, clipped in with the sea, that chides the banks of England, Scotland, Wales, which calls me pupil or hath read to me, and brings him out what is but woman's son, can trace me in the tedious ways of art, and hold me pace in deep experiments. I think there is no man speaks better Welsh. I'll to dinner. So he's just like blowing him off. Yeah, okay, whatever you say. Let's go sit down and eat. Mortimer jumps in. Peace, cousin Percy. You will make him mad. Hotspur's real name is Percy, but they call him Hotspur because he has a fiery, temper and things like that. I can call spirits from the vasty deep. Why, so can I, or so can any men. But will they come when you do call for them? Why, I can teach you, cousin, to command the devil. And I can teach thee, cuz, to shame the devil. By telling truth, tell truth and shame the devil. If thou have power to raise him, bring him hither. And I'll be sworn I have power to shame him hence. Or while you live, tell truth and shame the devil. And it's really that climax that I love about this. So basically, like I said, they're trying to outdo each other, or Glendower's trying to brag, and Hotspur's kind of like knocking him down. And they're trying to, like I said, outdo each other. I can call spirits. Yeah, I can do that too. He says, I can teach you to command the devil. So what's what greater power is there than that? If you can actually control the devil, make the devil do your bidding, how can you top that? Well, he says, telling the truth, tell truth and shame the devil, which I think is a great line. And I think again, it's something very relevant now, and it is at any time. It's kind of like an eternal saying, I would say. But this idea that the only power sort of greater than the devil, literally than the satanic power, the demonic power of the devil, is the truth. The truth has more power than the devil. I think that's a great line. And I think one of the most, probably my favorite sort of, exchange within, Shakespeare, at least outside of his more, well-known plays. I don't think that's actually recreated in Chimes at Midnight, which is unfortunate, but it does borrow, many other scenes. Anyway, so now we start to get into the play itself, into Julius Caesar. So of course, Act 1, Scene 1 begins with the two tribunes. What are their names? Flavius and Marulus, which is interesting because the tribunes are supposed to represent the people, but they have, they're full of, bitterness and condescension towards the people of Rome, because the people of Rome are, so enamored by Caesar, right? So they say, wherefore rejoice? What conquest brings he home? What tributaries follow him to Rome? To grace in captive bonds his chariot wheels. You blocks, you stones, you worse than senseless things. Oh, you hard hearts, you cruel men of Rome, knew you not Pompey, many a time and oft? Have you climbed up to walls and battlements, to towers and windows, yea, to chimney tops, your infants in your arms, and there have sat the livelong day with patient expectation to see great Pompey pass the streets of Rome? I'm glad I'm not doing this, on stage. Anyway, so yeah, they're mad at the people, obviously. Funny enough, I don't know if we'll get to it, but Anthony says the exact same. Well, sort of inverts this thing where he says, "You blocks, you stones, you worse than senseless things," and he says, "You're not like that. You're not blocks. You're not stones. You're people." But is Anthony really sincere, or is he really manipulating the people? I think it's probably the latter. And again, like I said, they're all so broken up about Pompey, the irony here being is that, if Pompey had triumphed over Caesar, they'd be saying probably the exact same things about him that they're saying about Caesar. So this is now Cassius speaking to Brutus. I just selected, parts of the play that I thought were, interesting to go over in class. So Cassius says to Brutus, now we're in scene 2, of course, why, man, he doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs and peep about to find ourselves dishonorable graves. Men at some time are masters of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. So what do you think Cassius is trying to say here? I think it's a very interesting part as well. And it speaks a lot, I think, to Cassius's motivation as well as the motivation of the other conspirators here. In that Brutus, like I said, might have his own sort of noble motivations, maybe, for opposing Caesar. But Cassius just seems to be envious that he's in the presence of a man greater than himself, a colossus, while people like him just sort of, scurry about and, just try to, eke out a living. And, and again, these are part of the upper classes, so they're not, they're more than just surviving. But you can imagine that the way in which they survive and thrive is by, kissing ass, basically, and doing whatever, whatever, they have to do, basically, to sort of, hold on to their social status. And he says, we just walk under their legs and look around. And eventually we die. We our lives end, and we have not, achieved anything. We're not honorable men. Caesar, again, another sort of interesting parallel, has an interesting take on this idea as well. I think what the other thing that I think is interesting about this is that he says at some times we are master of our fates, thus implying that, sometimes things do happen to us that are sort of outside of our control. But there are times, at least, where we can actually control, what's going on around us. And the phrase, the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves. That's a very, famous line as well. In other words, it's not just fate or destiny that we're, condemned to live this way. It's ourselves. He's basically saying, we're a bunch of wimps, basically. We don't stand up for ourselves. Which again probably says more about Cassius than it does Brutus. So now Caesar comes about. Again, one of the only, couple times that you really see Caesar. Now I skipped over it, but one of the parts I love about this scene is where, the soothsayer comes up to Caesar and tells him, beware the Ides of March, which of course is when Caesar is killed. And he says it twice to him, in fact, and Caesar just kind of blows him off. These kinds of elements, Shakespeare always seems to include these kinds of sort of, supernatural elements into his plays. Prophecies, visions, prophetic dreams, as well as other, even more blatant, ghosts and things like that. These things always, seem to be, an element within Shakespeare's plays, but which I think really adds a lot of great, dramatic intensity to it. So you kind of know already, and of course, anyone who was, seeing this play obviously knew what happens to Caesar. But Caesar's being warned basically early on. And he's not heeding the warning. Overconfidence, maybe, could that be the idea that Shakespeare is trying to convey here, that Caesar's just completely full of himself. He doesn't take, he's not worried about anything, even though behind his back, people are literally conspiring to kill him. But what he says about Cassius is interesting here. He says, let me have men about me that are fat, sleek-headed men, and such as sleep o' nights. Yon Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous. I like this idea. He wants to, like jolly fat guys, basically around him the whole time, like Orson Welles, maybe. But what he says about Cassius or Cassius, I should probably make up my mind how I want to say his name. I guess Cassius is the correct way to say it. Yon Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous. I like that idea. The idea that Cassius is not, he's not a fun-loving guy. And there's a longer passage, which I didn't include here, where Shakespeare says that, he doesn't like songs like Mark Antony. He doesn't like, plays. He's not a fun-loving guy, basically. He sits around and he thinks. And, what is Caesar basically saying? I mean, there's an element to it that sounds vaguely anti-intellectual almost. He's basically saying the people that just, sit around thinking all day and aren't enjoying life are dangerous people. But what makes them dangerous? It's not that they're thinking. It's, it's the suggestion of, bitterness, resentment, maybe, which plays a role here. Interestingly, this would be, a theme that Nietzsche talks about in his writings, this idea of what he called ressentiment, the idea that, people that just sit around, and aren't, sort of, expressing their will to power, or whatever you want to call it, out, living life to the fullest, that they get sort of consumed by envy and bitterness and resentment and things like that. And that actually makes them a danger, that they secretly hate those who are, capable of living a more fulfilling life. Anyway, Caesar's diagnosis of Cassius in this way seems very accurate. He pretty much has Cassius figured out. The fact that he still doesn't take him seriously, though, I think it is interesting as well. Probably suggests that Caesar is not being overconfident here. So then Cassius and Brutus. Cassius and Brutus are talking again. Casca now runs up to them, and he relates several things to them, which they do not exactly observe, which is interesting as well. First of all, he talks about how he saw Caesar fall, which they refer to as the falling sickness. Now, that is actually true. Caesar was an epileptic, did apparently suffer from seizures. That is a real historical aspect of him. Maybe more importantly, Casca claims that he saw Caesar refuse the crown 3 times, but in a obviously very sort of rehearsed, performative way. And this idea of political performance or political theater is important as well. That political leaders act one way in public, but then another way in private. Very important idea. And so Caesar, oh yeah, no, I don't want the crown. Yeah, I'm just a humble, a humble man, a humble servant of Rome. Whereas of course, secretly he is the opposite of that, right? He is of course lusting after power. But he sort of goes through this, performance basically to show the people what a good guy he is. Which is interesting. Now, again, Casca is saying that this happened. So, Brutus doesn't actually see this. There's a possibility that, Casca could have made it up or exaggerated it or something like that. But, I guess we could assume that this probably happened. Now, they mentioned Cicero. They said, well, what did Cicero do? Well, he spoke Greek, which is kind of funny. Kind of saying that, like, all Cicero does, sort of speaks to Cicero as being sort of the, definitive interpreter of the Greek philosophers during this period of time, but also saying that Cicero's not really doing all that much either. He's just giving this flowery speech in Greek. Casca claims he doesn't understand what he's saying. He's like, yeah, it's Greek to me, which I think has also become kind of a famous phrase when people say that. I know I've heard other people say that somewhere when they say, oh, it's Greek to me. It's basically like they're saying like, yeah, it goes over my head. I don't know what they're saying basically. I don't know if anyone else has ever heard that statement before. Now, another interesting thing that you often find within Shakespeare's plays is that there's sort of, disturbances within nature that occur, which sort of reflect the sort of social or political disturbances that go on within the play. Excuse me. So this is Casca saying things that he saw, basically. He says, a common slave, you'd know him well by sight, held up his left hand, which did flame and burn, like 20 torches joined, and yet his hand, not sensible of fire, remained unscorched. Besides, I had not put up my sword. Against the Capitol I met a lion, who glared upon me and went surly by, without annoying me. And there were drawn upon a heap 100 ghastly women, transformed with their fear, who swore they saw men all in fire walk up and down the streets. And yesterday the bird of night did sit, even at noonday, upon the marketplace, hooting and shrieking. When these prodigies do so conjointly meet, let not men say, these are their reasons, they are natural, for I believe they are portentous things unto the climate that they point upon. So again, and this is a very common thing that you see in a lot of Shakespeare's plays. So when something is amiss, when Hamlet's father is murdered, or when King Duncan in Macbeth is murdered, you see these sort of the sort of unbalancing, basically, the injustice that's going on, this unbalancing of the social and political world is reflected by an unbalancing of nature. Now, obviously, this is a symbolic thing, right? I mean, I guess you would say that the natural world is quite indifferent to the social and political conflicts that people have. But in Shakespeare's world, he uses these things as sort of, again, heightening the dramatic intensity, basically. And it's very, vivid, kind of imagery that he's talking about is vivid. Now, this is also, by the way, again, another parallel by Calpurnia or Calphurnia, different spellings used sometimes. Who also says that she's seeing things like this. She references, seeing the lioness. Apparently, there's a lion just, walking around Rome and just hanging out there, not bothering anybody, but's there. She sees other things. She sees, she's talking about, graves giving up their dead, like zombies, basically, the dead coming back to life. So all these things are happening. There's this, disturbance basically within the natural world, which is, again, a reflection of basically, what's going on in the political world that they inhabit, basically. So Cassius says about Caesar, it's like, look, I kind of get it. Caesar's, just becoming a tyrant because he can, because, the people of Rome are idiots, basically. And why should Caesar be a tyrant then? Poor man, I know he would not be a wolf, but that he sees the Romans are but sheep. He were no lion, were not Romans hinds. Those that with haste will make a mighty fire, begin it with weak straws. What trash is Rome? What rubbish and what offal, when it serves for the base matter to illuminate so vile a thing as Caesar. But oh grief, where hast thou led me? I perhaps speak this before a willing bondsman. Then I know my answer must be made, but I am armed, and dangers are to me indifferent. So again, like I said, I mean, Caesar is sort of taking advantage of the situation because the Roman people are essentially allowing him. Which I think is, another important thing. I mean, very rarely do tyrants come to power without support, even, I mean, in our day or in recent history. I mean, Hitler, did not just, seize power and conquer Germany and set himself up as ruler of Germany in that way. He was elected to power. It may have been a fraudulent election, or there may have been, things going on to influence that. Or, again, even Donald Trump, quite frankly. I mean, Donald Trump lost the popular vote, but, he still won a legitimate election according to the rules set in our Constitution and our wonderful Electoral College. I mean, Trump's election was much more legitimate than George Bush in 2000. Who, again, also, George Bush and his cronies stole the election, but people kind of let it happen. They didn't really do anything about it. Least of all, Al Gore and the Democratic Party. Anyway, I don't want to re-litigate the election of 2000. But again, another very important idea that still, I think, is relevant. That tyrants can only come into power when they have, if not the active support, at least the passive indifference of the population. So now we move on to Act 2. And the first scene, Brutus now. So I kind of skipped over the parts where, Cassius is really sort of, working on Brutus, try to get him over to their cause. And you can debate, to what extent, how hard a time does Cassius have convincing Brutus. I would say it doesn't take that much effort on his part to convince him. But Brutus is at least somewhat torn by it. because he has great personal affection towards Caesar. And so he says, it must be by his death. And for my part, I know no personal cause to spurn at him, but for the general. He would be crowned. How that might change his nature, there's the question. So Brutus likes Caesar personally, maybe even loves him. And besides that, Caesar really hasn't at this point really done anything wrong. He hasn't really done anything that tyrannical. He's been a general, but he's basically fought, loyally and effectively for the Roman people. He was in this conflict with Pompey, but like I said, I mean, if Pompey won the conflict, things wouldn't have turned out that much differently. He's questioning, like, what will Caesar become if we allow him to sort of rise to power? Will he become a tyrant? And obviously Brutus, ultimately makes up his mind that he thinks that Caesar, poses enough of a danger, basically, that the threat is real. Now here's very interesting piece, where you could say that Brutus is sort of sowing the seeds of his own future destruction, in fact, or sort of doing things that will eventually lead to his own ruin, because he's basically telling them, no, you don't need to worry about Antony. Antony will be fine. Of course, that's not exactly what happens at all. But I also think that, what this passage reveals, well, it's actually two. And the second one, I skipped over a few lines too, but Brutus seems to be almost trying to like rationalize what they're doing, right? Like, he doesn't want to acknowledge that, like, we're just murdering a guy, basically, that we're actually doing something good, and that we should not be ashamed, essentially, of what we're doing. He says, our course will seem too bloody, Caius Cassius, meaning talking about killing Antony as well, to cut the head off and then hack the limbs, like wrath in death and envy afterwards. For Antony is but a limb of Caesar. Let us be sacrificers, but not butchers, Caius. We all stand up against the spirit of Caesar, and in the spirit of men there is no blood. So basically saying, we're just going to kill Caesar. We're not going to kill his supporters like Antony or anyone else. And this is a very interesting phrase where he says that, by killing the spirit of Caesar, this is a bloodless crime, basically, or he's basically saying there will be no blood, which to me seems almost like a delusional thing to say. Of course there's going to be blood. They are killing a man. But does Brutus here not want to fully acknowledge what he's doing, or pretend that this is not a violent action or something like that? Anyway, skip a few more lines, but he then goes on to say, let's kill him boldly but not wrathfully. Let's carve him as a dish fit for the gods, not hew him as a carcass fit for hounds. And let our hearts, as subtle masters do, stir up their servants to an act of rage, and after seem to chide him. Which, again, is a very big mistake on his part, because, again, it is basically Caesar's followers like Antony, or chiefly Antony, that basically go after them later. And this idea that, by killing him, it's a sacrifice for the gods, that they're going to almost murder this guy, but they're going to do it in a very dignified way or fashion. It's a very, very odd sentiment, to say the least. Now you see a scene with Portia and Brutus, and women, female characters in Shakespeare are very interesting in the way that they are portrayed. I'm not sure exactly what a feminist reading of Shakespeare would be like. I'm sure there's plenty of examples out there. From what I could tell, though, it seems like that maybe not all, but several female characters within Shakespeare are usually portrayed as very strong characters. Portia, Lady Macbeth, who maybe is more ruthless than Macbeth, maybe not a good character, definitely not a good character. But Portia is Hotspur, actually, from Henry IV, has a good relationship with his wife as well, and there are other examples too. What stands out here, I think, is that Portia and Brutus seem to relate to each other as equals. There's not really a sense that I can tell, at least, that Portia's subordinate to Brutus. She does talk about, yes, you're judging me by my sex and things like that. And that might speak to the overall, sort of gender politics that existed in Rome and, in Shakespeare's day, and in our day as well, for that matter, of course. But individually speaking, of course, Portia and Brutus don't seem to exactly have that kind of relationship. Their relationship seems to, at least to some extent, kind of transcend those gender roles, at least based on how I'm reading it here. Anyway, she says to Brutus, she said, if this were true, then should I know the secret? In other words, she wants Brutus to basically open up about what's going on. I grant I am a woman, but withal a woman that Lord Brutus took to wife. I grant I am a woman, but withal a woman well reputed Cato's daughter. Think you I am no stronger than my sex, being so fathered and so husbanded? Tell me your counsels, I will not disclose them. I have made strong proof of my constancy, giving myself a voluntary wound here in the thigh. Can I bear that with patience and not my husband's secrets? So she's saying, yeah, look, I'm a woman, which, again, doesn't speak well to the, to the role of women at this time. We're saying, but I'm a woman that you took as your wife, and you're a great man, so I must be a great woman, I guess. And and my father, Cato is very prominent Roman as well. Now the thing that's odd here is when she talks about giving herself a voluntary wound. I'm not exactly sure what the significance is of that, if that was a common thing that was done, and what even the significance of it is for her individually speaking. So she wounded herself to what, basically show that she's tough, or that has resolve or something like that. Yeah, Jerome.
It may be completely stupid, but as she is referring to a thigh, perhaps she's referring to being pregnant, the family, something like that, perhaps.
Maybe, yeah. I don't really know. I mean, honestly, I don't know what the significance of that is. Being pregnant, here in the thigh. I don't know. I'm not sure. Give myself a voluntary wound here in the thigh. Can I bear that with patience? I mean, it does. Yeah, it does sound like she's saying that. Yeah, look, I've gone through pregnancy. I don't understand the thigh part though, unless she's referring to her genitals or something like that. But that's not really in the thigh. I don't know. I mean, it's a very, I mean, it's part of the reason I highlighted it here. I was a little confused by this passage. But anyway, the overall meaning is that she's basically, look, I'm a tough woman, basically. I can handle this. Why are you having secrets from me? And again, it implies or suggests that, overall, it seems like they have a pretty good marriage. The Brutus doesn't normally keep secrets from her, for example. And that in this case, it stands out, and she's aware that he's keeping something from her, and she wants to know what's going on. And he does kind of open up to her. So now we go to Act 2, Scene 2. It's a fairly short play. It moves pretty quickly. Calpurnia, or as it says here, Calphurnia, it looks like, has visions and a prophetic dream, which I've already sort of referenced. This is really outside of Act 1, Scene 2. This is the most you really see of Caesar. Again, it doesn't really show up in the play all that often. And he dies in Act 3. So, although his ghost appears after that. Now, again, when she warns about these things, initially he listens. He's like, "Look, I'm not going to come today. Just tell him I'm not coming." Basically, he says something that's interesting. He's like, the cause is my will. In other words, like what's causing me not to come is that I just don't feel like coming, basically. But Decius, who was again a part of the conspiracy, knows that obviously he needs to get Caesar to come to the Senate. So he appeals to his vanity. He appeals to his lust for power. He literally tells them that they're going to crown him king when he goes there, and that gets Caesar to come. He also he takes Calphurnia's dream and reinterprets it in a very interesting way. Whereas in her dream, he sees a statue of Caesar bleeding, and supplied from different orifices from the body as well, which maybe is an interesting parallel to what we were just talking about with Portia, perhaps. But Decius says, no, that's actually a good thing. And Caesar basically believes it. Again, I'll not go into detail about it. Read the scene. You'll see what I'm talking about. But Caesar says something interesting too, which I think is a very memorable line. He says, cowards die many times before their deaths, The valiant never taste of death but once. Of all the wonders that I yet have heard, it seems to me most strange that men should fear, seeing that death, a necessary end, will come when it will come. So what he's saying there basically is, why do people fear the death? We're all going to die. Why do you fear it? And again, many people in their, assignments talked about, how Shakespeare speaks to the so-called human condition and things like that, which, I would say is true. And it certainly comes through, I think, in statements like this. I mean, revealing a very sort of, existential fear that everyone feels, the fear of death. But he's saying, well, look, you're going to die anyway, so why do you worry about your death so much? I also like the line, cowards die many times before their deaths. Which is saying that, if you're a coward, you disgrace yourself, basically. And that's almost like akin to dying, basically, that you grovel around, you're submissive, things like that. I can almost picture, I mentioned before the scene with Hotspur and Glendower being like a rap battle. I could almost picture like a rap artist using a line like this or something like that, or probably has. Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant taste death only once. Okay, and then of course, jumping ahead, Act 3, Scene 1, Caesar's murdered, famous scene. E2 Brute, as he's stabbed by Brutus, as Casca starts it off, and all the other conspirators run up and stab him. Brutus sort of delivers the killing blow. NU Brutus is basically what the phrase means. It's actually kept in Latin. I should mention also that Shakespeare is very much influenced by Plutarch's brief lives, or the lives of Romans. So he's using a real historical source here. After Caesar is killed, I forget actually off the top of my head if it's Casca or Cassius that says it, or maybe one of the others, but they say, liberty, freedom, tyranny is dead. Run, hence proclaim, cry it about the streets. Now, again, going back to what we've been talking about, Rome is an oligarchy. These are the oligarchic citizens within Rome. Is the death of Caesar really a victory for liberty and freedom? Maybe for the oligarchs, but for the average Roman, is that really the case? I mean, if Caesar was murdered in part because he was trying to cancel the debts of the commoners within Rome, I mean, is that really, to the benefit of the Roman citizens that Caesar is now dead? Simply put, when I hear them saying this, liberty, freedom, it rings kind of hollow to me. I mean, about as hollow as hearing George Bush, talk about liberty or freedom. It's just kind of like a mask for the class interest, basically, which are sort of acting here. At least that's my way of looking at it. Now, Antony at first appears to go along, right? He shakes their bloody hands. But of course, he very quickly has a turnabout. Now, you could argue, was he sincere in this moment? Was he just doing what was advantageous to keep himself alive at the moment? Probably the latter. I mean, he was, never intending to go along with them, but just did so because he had to. Here's a famous illustration painting rather, of Caesar's death. Now, a great example of irony is Antony's speech to the crowd. In other words, what you're saying is different than what you actually mean. That's sort of like a very, sort of literal definition of irony. And of course, that is what Antony is doing. He's telling people, oh yeah, Brutus, yeah, he's an honorable man. But is that what Antony really means? No, he means the opposite. And so it's a great example of irony. It's a great example of rhetoric. It shows you, again, another example of how sort of malleable, the crowds are within Rome. Because again, at first they side with Brutus when he tells them what happened. But Antony's very, again, fairly quickly able to get them on his side. And again, paralleling or echoing in some ways the line from Act 1. It says, "You're not wood, you're not stones." But you wonder how sincere he is about that. Now, this is a very famous part of Shakespeare. I'd like to try to read it. And again, hopefully not butcher it too much, which I think I have here. So the famous opening line, I think everyone's heard this: "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." Again, if you watch the Marlon Brando version of this, you can hear Brando do this speech, who plays Mark Antony. Again, so, keep in mind, the ironic aspects of the speech, as well as the rhetorical aspects, the way he's able to persuade people, persuade the crowd, who, again, look, this guy, this Caesar was a tyrant. To her best, he speak no harm of Brutus here. So they're all on Brutus's side, basically. Then Antony comes up and is basically able to sway them. So he says, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. So let it be with Caesar. The noble Brutus hath told you Caesar was ambitious. If it were so, it was a grievous fault, and grievously has Caesar answered it. Here, under leave of Brutus and the rest, for Brutus is an honorable man. So are they all honorable men. Come, I to speak in Caesar's funeral. He was my friend, faithful and just to me. But Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. He hath brought many captives home to Rome, whose ransoms did the general coffers fill. Did this in Caesar seem ambitious? When the poor have cried, Caesar hath wept. Ambition should be made of sterner stuff. Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. So you can see how he keeps repeating that line over and over again. That's ironic, right? He doesn't mean what he's actually saying. He thinks Brutus is a piece of shit, basically, for murdering his friend. But he's not coming right out and saying it. He's sort of doing it in an ironic way, and also, again, using rhetoric to very subtly sort of influence the people to thinking the way he wants them to think. You all did see that on the Lupercal, I thrice presented him a kingly crown. Again, the event that Casca referenced earlier. So that would, confirm that what Casca was saying is actually true. Which he did thrice refuse. Was this ambition? Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and sure he is an honorable man. I speak not to disprove what Brutus spoke, but here I am to speak what I do know. You all did love him once, not without cause. What cause withholds you then to mourn for him? O judgment, thou art fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason. Bear with me. My heart is in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause till it come back to me. And of course, the people are starting to be swayed already. Poor soul, his eyes are red as fire with weeping. Now mark him, he begins to speak. He begins again to speak. So he goes on. He says, but yesterday the word of Caesar might have stood against the world. Now lies he there, and none so poor to do him reverence. O masters, if I were disposed to stir your hearts and minds to mutiny and rage, I should do Brutus wrong and Cassius wrong, who you all know are honorable men. Again, saying that several times now. I will not do them wrong. I rather choose to wrong the dead, to wrong myself and use, than I will wrong such honorable men. But here's a parchment with the seal of Caesar. I found it in his closet. 'Tis his will. Let but the commons hear this testament, which, pardon me, I do not mean to read. And they would go and kiss dead Caesar's wounds and dip their napkins in his sacred blood. Yea, beg a hair of him for memory, and dying, mention it within their wills, bequeathing it as a rich legacy unto their issue. And so, of course, he's like, well, should I read the will? And they're like, yeah, read it. Have patience, gentle friends. I must not read it. It is not meet you know how Caesar loved you. You are not wood, you are not stones, but men. And being men, hearing the will of Caesar, it will inflame you. It will make you mad. 'Tis good you know that you are his heirs. For if you should, oh, what would come of it? Read the will, read the will. Will you be patient? Will you stay a while? I have overshot myself to tell you of it. I fear I wrong the honorable man, whose daggers have stabbed Caesar. I do fear it. Now they're saying that they're traitors. They were totally on the side of Brutus and them a moment ago. And now they're saying, oh, they're traitors. The will, the testament. They were villains, murderers. The will, read the will. And so he's like, all right, should I do it? He's kind of, again, playing to them as well. I mean, this is, a great example of rhetoric and sort of, manipulating people, basically, to do what you want. If you have tears, prepare to shed them now. You all do know this mantle. I remember the first time ever Caesar put it on. This was on a summer evening in his tent. That day he overcame the Nervi. Look in this place ran Cassius' dagger through. See what it rent the envious Casca made. So now he's starting to speak a little bit more what he really means. Through this, the well-loved Brutus stabbed, and as he plucked his cursed steel away, mark how the blood of Caesar followed it, as rushing out of doors to be resolved. If Brutus so unkindly knocked or no, for Brutus, as you know, was Caesar's angel. Judge, O you gods, how dearly Caesar loved him. So it was the most unkindest cut of all. For when the noble Caesar saw him stab, ingratitude, more strong than traitor's arms, quite vanquished him, then burst his mighty heart, and in his mantle muffling up his face, even at the base of Pompey's statue, which all the while ran blood, great Caesar fell. Oh, what a fall was there, my countrymen. Then I and you and all of us fell down, whilst bloody treason flourished over us. Oh, now you weep, and I perceive you feel the dint of pity. These are gracious drops. Kind souls, what weep you when you but behold? Our Caesar's venture wounded. Look you here. He here is himself marred, as you see, with traitors. I almost read that whole thing without screwing it up. All right. So again, now they're totally on the side of Antony. I'll cut this short a little bit because I think you kind of get the point. There was a part though where he starts to read out his will, and he's like, yeah, look, you're all going to get some money out of this and things like that. I don't think he actually refers explicitly to canceling debts, but he was going to do things to try to financially benefit the people. Now, in real life, at least from what I've read, Caesar was actually trying to cancel the debts. And look, I'm not trying to say, I think I said this when we were talking about Cicero several weeks ago. I'm not trying to say these people were completely noble-minded. I mean, it's very likely that Caesar was doing this out of his own political ambitions, but at least correctly understood the strategic value of doing something like that. That this is a good way to get the people on your sides, who were, of course, suffering under the debts that have been sort of laid upon them by the upper class Roman citizens at this time. Here's a will. I feel like there's another great example of irony that I want to read out. Well, so he's saying, you're not stones, you're not wood, which I wonder if he really means that. I mean, he clearly realizes what he's doing to manipulate these people. Anyway, so I think you get the point. And then basically the last scene, this poor poet Cinna gets mistaken for one of the conspirators, who's also named Cinna. And the crowd just, savages this guy, basically kills him. And they either kill him. Yeah, so they say, tear him to pieces. He's a conspirator. I am Cinna the poet. I am Cinna the poet. Tear him for his bad verses. So they realize, okay, he's not the guy that killed Caesar, but let's kill him anyway because he's a shitty poet, basically. He's probably not even a bad poet, but the people don't want to hear any of that. So that's, I guess you'd almost call that a bit of like black humor or comedy on Shakespeare's part. I mean, there is, of course, humor in Shakespeare's plays. Even he did write comedies, but even within the tragedies, there are examples of that. This is a painting entitled Cinna the Poet from the 1950s, which basically, in a very abstract way, depicts the murder of Cinna the Poet. And again, and so that pretty much ends Act 3. So we're just going through the first 3 acts. In this class, we'll finish out the play next class. Does anyone have any questions for me about anything? So let me just say a couple things about the midterm and the paper. So the midterms are now completed. There were a few people that were not able to complete them on the day of the exam, and I don't really grade the exams until everyone has completed them. So they were just all finished basically just a couple days ago. So I've not really had much of a chance to look at them yet, but I will, and I'll grade them soon. You will be able to see the grade, and you should be able to see what any comments I write on Canvas as well. As far as the paper topics, I've spoken to a few people about that. The paper topics, we're supposed to be due today, but I kind of consider that to be a soft deadline, as people say. So if you don't have your paper topic yet, that's okay. You should definitely be thinking about it though. Thinking about what you want to write about. There are, guidelines for that within the syllabus, which you should go over if you haven't already. The basic bare bones idea of this is that, essentially you want to sort of, weigh in on one of the thinkers that we've gone over in this class. And essentially you're going to make up an argument, whether or not, to what extent you sort of agree, disagree, partly agree with what they're saying. Now, of course, that would require, if you're doing, Plato, for example, that you understand Plato's ideas well enough that you can sort of formulate an idea of what his views are on, say, justice, for example, and that you then make your own contribution, by arguing whether or not you agree with what he says, and basically, support that in the the text of the essay itself. All right, so when you have your topic, you should just email it to me. Again, a few people have, but I'll be expecting more in the coming days, I guess. All right, anything else? Yeah, Jerome.
Can I ask you a question about my paper?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I'll stop recording and I'll end the Zoom now. Just hang on to the Zoom. Let me just do that.